Okay. I want to start with a quote from my dissertation, actually. The humanistic view was well represented by the writings of Laurentius Valla, 1405 to 1457, a famous scholar of the Italian Renaissance. Valla emphasized the importance of language. According to him, the decline of civilization in the Dark Ages was due to the decay of the Greek and Latin languages. Hence, it was only through the study of classical literature that the glories of ancient Greece and Rome could be recaptured. Valla also wrote a treatise on the Latin Vulgate, comparing it with certain Greek New Testament manuscripts which he had in his possession. Erasmus, who from his youth had been an admirer of Valla, found a manuscript of Valla's treatise in 1504 and had it printed in the following year. In this work, Valla favored the Greek New Testament text over the Vulgate. The Latin text often differed from the Greek, he reported. Also, there were omissions and additions in the Latin translation, and the Greek wording was generally better than that of the Latin. I think that is a good, a great place to start in regard to the German Reformation. Knowing this, that the humanist Erasmus has a big impact on the theological Reformation, and that large impact is in this area of the Greek text, in this area of language, that the humanists were saying and inspiring and getting the students to get back to a language that had decayed, a knowledge, a skill that had disappeared almost. And Valla was right, that the decay of the use of Greek and Latin meant also a decay not just of civilization itself, but also of the church. At the time of Martin Luther, he makes a statement that Christ cannot be found in the church, nor the gospel. And the church doesn't know where to find it. They had not a clue. Even the Latin Vulgate, the inferior text, wasn't one of study. One of the things that I feel is pertinent in both Pelikan and Oberman is this, that their emphasis on the humanists and the inspiration that they brought to rekindle those languages and the study of it. And eventually, someone will discover the New Testament. They've got to. And the one who discovers that New Testament really is Erasmus. But there were some underworkings there. Let me tell you a little bit about Erasmus. In 1495, he studies theology at the University of Paris. And that, believe me, says a lot. Remember, we talked about the triumvirate of schools: Oxford, Paris, and Prague. Prague, of where Huss was; Oxford, where Wycliffe; and Paris, now where Erasmus emerges. Was Erasmus a reformer? I have to say yes. And the reason why I say yes was he remained in the church. He reformed the church and remained neutral. And most of his career, he remained neutral to the reformers of Germany and Switzerland, and also to the church. Now, later in his life, he was forced to make a stand. And interestingly enough, he makes a stand against both. And it ostracizes him for the rest of his life. His writings alone brought about a great deal of thought in scholastic circles. In fact, it brought medieval scholasticism out of its, should I say, trench. One of the primary, I hope I have my hand out here. I'll skip this part. I don't have my hand out. I'll get it after a bit. I want to give you an example of the type of work that came out of men like Erasmus, not necessarily directly, but indirectly by his work, his textual work in the New Testament Greek. And it was something that we had talked about last night in our exegesis class. It's found in the passage in 2 Timothy. And by the way, the hermeneutic that I'm going to use is one that Philip Melanchthon would be well pleased in. So let's read 2 Timothy chapter 4. I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom. Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths. Now, I find it very interesting that the term that Paul uses with Timothy, and let me put this epistle in a historical context. This is Paul's second imprisonment. It's toward the end of his life, and he and I believe at the time Luke was the only one with him. And he writes this letter to Timothy to urge him to come to him. Essentially saying this, that his ministry in Ephesus was over. Now, I believe that Paul knew several things. One, John was there now. That John would lead the church in Ephesus. That Timothy, he wished, could come to him by winter. It says in chapter 4, verse 21. Make every effort to come before winter. He also says, hey, bring those texts. I have need of those texts. You know, the parchments. The term, I solemnly charge, that's not a very good translation. It is more, I testify. I with solemn witness. So in other words, he's going to make testimony of something. There's no charge in this at all. And I want to emphasize that. There's no charge in this word. It is, I testify solemnly. By what? By his appearance, not his coming, his appearance. By his appearing and by his kingdom, not kingdom to come, but one already established. Now he continues. He says in verse 2, preach the word in the English text. But this is an imperative verb. But an imperative means maybe three things. A command, an exclamation, or an exhortation. And that exhortation is usually done by an exclamation. Now it's an aorist tense. The tense of this means this. And I know that a lot of people bandy about with tenses in the Greek and say, well, only an indicative verb or only the empirical verb has a time sense. Well, I don't buy that. But this is an aorist tense. In other words, past tense verb. Now, I don't know of any commands that can be past tense, but an exclamation can be. So, in other words, what Paul is saying is he's saying, Timothy, you have preached. Exclamation. You have preached the word in and out of season. Wow. You have done the job in Ephesus. You have accomplished the work in Ephesus. Now come to me. So, in other words, the exhortation is based on the activity of Timothy in the past. On an exclamation that Paul makes, knowing full well that Timothy did a great job in Ephesus. Now, you have to take another approach if you take this as a command. One, that Paul doesn't know that Timothy is on his way to Paul. But, oh gosh, in chapter 4, hey, make every effort to come before winter. He knew, didn't he? So he knows that Timothy is on his way to him, and he wants him before winter. You know, if you've got plans through winter, break them, come. And his encouragement is his performance in Ephesus. Now the proof of that is this. One must, if Ephesus needs something else, one must make also a position that Ephesus was failing or flailing. Well, in Revelation 2:1 and on, you see that they didn't fail at all. In fact, they were commended for their adherence to sound doctrine. The doctrine that was taught by Timothy and Paul and John. And later, you see in 1 John a statement by John saying this, "You have no need of a teacher. The Holy Spirit will lead you into all things. You have the anointing of the Holy Spirit. You don't have need of a teacher." Now the reason why he could say that was he knew them and he knew their doctrine was sound. Why? Because they had been taught by Paul and by Timothy and by John. That is Philip Melanchthon hermeneutics. That is the hermeneutics that was established at the time of the Reformation. The historical grammatical methodology brought about by Erasmus, Luther. Those were the things that were rekindled by the Reformation, that were all but lost. That were all but lost. Martin Luther, in his earlier life, was put into law school by his parents. And he was and I don't remember the university, I'll have to get that for you, I'll bring it back later. He was in one of the finest European law schools, and one day one of his best friends was struck by lightning and killed. And this made a big impact on Martin Luther. And he decided at that point in time, to the chagrin of his parents, that point in time he would enter the monastery and become an Augustinian monk. I'm glad he didn't decide to become a Franciscan monk or a Benedictine monk. But in so doing, he needed the education, and so he actually attended University of Wittenberg under the care of a professor named John Staupitz. So Staupitz is his mentor, and Staupitz did several interesting things. He wasn't a reformer per se, and yet he was a reformer because he was steering Martin Luther in a lot of things. But Martin Luther had to work out some other events in his life. He bought Ockhamism. He was educated in Ockhamism, and he, remember, the Occamists said there is nothing that you can really know. In a sense, they were, I guess, agnostic. And so therefore, you really don't know what is required of you, nor do you know who God is. that combination from Rome brought an incredible resurgence of the use of penance and indulgence and other forms of Catholic economics. And Martin Luther was trying to accomplish holiness and righteousness and please God by works, of which he was always unsure and, in fact, even distraught, understanding that he wasn't getting anywhere, and he wasn't, and nothing was being accomplished toward righteousness. Well, Staupitz, knowing his distress, put him into the Scriptures, into the Greek New Testament. Actually, it was Erasmus's text. So evidently Staupitz had some connection with the University of Paris and with Erasmus. And through this, Martin Luther starts an exegesis of Romans. And when Luther discovers about grace in Romans chapter 5, it is as though the heavens were opened for him. Could you call it a conversion? Absolutely. Was that Martin Luther's conversion? Absolutely. Because prior to this, Luther understood that Christ was not found in the church, nor did the church know where to find him. And that's his quote. That's his statement. So the Reformation starts. And with Luther, it starts individually. He is a reformed man. He sees certain things that he'd like to change also. He becomes, under Staupitz's care, the department head of theology and biblical studies at Wittenberg. And he starts with a series of lectures on Romans. I say the setting is the U of Dub. University of Wittenberg, not University of Washington. And the response of his lectures on Romans were this: the students drop scholasticism classes and study Reuchlin and Erasmus, increase their skills in Greek and Latin and biblical studies. The next event, and I believe that Martin Luther saw his path laid out in front of him. Because the next event that takes place is a public disputation at Wittenberg. And interesting enough, one of the later to become one of the radical reformers, Karlstadt, publishes a 151 thesis, and that in April 1517. And Luther helps Karlstadt in his disputation. So really, Karlstadt at this time is kind of the foremost of the reformers. He is the man at the lead. And you'll see this later at Leipzig, that it is actually Karlstadt's disputation at Leipzig, but it's Luther who captures the show. Immediately immediately the students jump on board. And there's a Reformation taking place at the University of Wittenberg. And all of the theology students, all of the biblical studies students, and even the art students are jumping on board of, at that time, these men become known as the Wittenbergers. The Wittenbergers. Now later that year, because of the indulgences that were commissioned by Leo X in Mainz, later that year, the 95 Thesis is published. And that was published, and I want to say this, that was published in October 31st, 1517. That was not when Luther attached the 95 Thesis to the door. That was probably done in August. But no one really knows when that was. Now, one of the things... Oh, by the way, I'm sorry that I had said that that was in Latin. No, it was in German. The 95 Thesis is in German. That was one of the plans that Martin Luther had to get the people on board with the Reformation, was put it in the vernacular. People do not understand Latin. The 151 Thesis of Karlstadt was in Latin. The 95 Thesis was in German. And it was posted to the Wittenberg door and read. On October 31st, that was when the first publishing took place. And that was in that little print shop that we showed the slides of. And as a result, not 3 or 4 copies were sent out, but thousands of copies were sent out. The next step in Luther's plans, or his path, was the Heidelberg Disputation, April 26, 1518. Now, I want to concentrate a little bit on the reaction to Luther. His lectures on the Romans brought about the students dropping scholasticism, or the medieval scholasticism, for the classics and for biblical exegesis. That his public disputation of Wittenberg reformed the theology department at Wittenberg University. That the 95 Thesis put Luther in a position to be the pastor of Germany, or the Germans, because he was talking to them in the vernacular. He was preaching to them in the vernacular. He started to hold the Mass in the vernacular. Pretty radical. Even Karlstadt still disputed in Latin, so that only the students would be able to understand. The population really wouldn't be able to understand. But Luther disputed in German, and printed in German, and wrote in German. The Heidelberg Disputation is where Luther's theology is presented to the Augustinian order. And that was in April 26th, 1518. Luther they understand Luther then as Erasmian, or one following Erasmus. The fifth event is the Leipzig Disputation in the summer of 1519. And Luther is seen by the Church of Rome as Hussite, on the order of John Huss. And as a result of the Leipzig Disputation, things change in regard to the Church and Luther. They see Luther as the one who is a heretic like Huss and should be done away with. That was, by the way, when Luther goes into hiding and Frederick puts him up and protects him as his protectorate. And the church in Rome actually thought he was dead for a period of about 18 months. But what he did during those 18 months was he worked on his translation in German of the New Testament. And he also wrote during that time. In fact, his writing was so intense that it says that he wrote a book every fortnight. During that 18-month period that he was at Frederick's castle in hiding, he was given a knighthood, I guess, so that he would be of nobility, so that he could put Luther as a distant relative of Frederick, and so he was masquerading as a second cousin or second niece or nephew, not niece, second nephew of Frederick. Karlstadt did not have a very good experience at Leipzig. And as a result, John Eck, who was the Catholic disputer, felt that he had finally defeated the Wittenbergers, and that was the end of that. And so he spent several weeks after the fact carousing and celebrating his victory. But what was happening at the University of Leipzig was the students and the faculty at the University of Leipzig were looking at this young monk's, Martin Luther's, disputation and seeing certain things and finding that he was really the one who won the disputation, that Eck did not know what he was talking about, and this young Martin Luther did and showed himself very well. As a result, the University of Leipzig jumps on the Wittenberg Reformation. Now, about some 9 months later, John Eck returns and expects his feet to be kissed at the gate. Instead, he's fleeing for his life. The Reformation has taken place in Leipzig now. And there's a momentum going on here. And many of the princes are finding themselves drawn. And remember, who were the university students? The university students were nobility. Not just anybody could go. You had to be either landed nobility or nobility. You had to be landed gentry or nobility to go to university. So there were those students were one of two people. Now I don't know, you've probably heard of the Hansas of Germany, mostly of northern Germany. That was the landed nobility who controlled some of these large cities, including Leipzig. Leipzig was one of them. They were economic geniuses who created a giant economy in Germany that their economic power was so great that they were granted nobility by the royals. And they were also given those cities as principalities. That's why these imperial cities crop up. Geneva was one of them. The economy of this landed nobility was so great that they controlled commerce for the feudal system. They were also the ones who were involved as students. So you have the nobles, and you have the landed gentry or the landed nobility in the universities, and catching hold of this Reformation that was going on. Finally, in 1520 at Wittenberg, at Elstergate, the Radical Reformation starts with a group, Karlstadt and Munzer, and along with that was the burning of canon law books, several other major revolutionary acts. Something that I think disturbed Martin Luther, and he comes out of hiding so that he can go take hold again of Wittenberg and keep it from the radical element. I want to read a little article from Oxford's Dictionary of the Popes, J.N.D. Kelly. Talking about Leo X. In addition to his pleasures, he had to pay for his wars, the projected crusade, and not least the construction of St. Peter's. To raise money, he borrowed extensively and sold offices, even cardinals' hats. For St. Peter's, he renewed the indulgence authorized by Julius II, and by a lucrative but wow, say that 3 times quick. And a deal with Albrecht of Brandenburg, Archbishop of Magdeburg and Mainz, arranged for indulgence to be promoted by preachers in his diocese. When the Dominican John Tetzel began preaching it in January of 1517, the Augustinian monk Martin Luther reacted by posting his 95 Thesis of protest on the church door at Wittenberg. When a summary of Luther's ideas reached Rome early in 1518, Leo instructed the general of his order to silence him. Now, I don't know how you understand the term silence him, but to the Pope in Rome, that would mean, especially to a military consultant, to destroy him or kill him. But to John Eck, that's not what that meant. That meant to shut him up by defeating him so that he looked silly. Now that's what John Eck was trying to do. And John Eck was quite a character. No substance, just character. And as a result, he lost the students. He gained the population, but he lost the students. And that turned around and I guess bit John Eck, and you'll see that later. He is trying to bring Luther back in by disputation and trying to bring him around, but it doesn't work. And this is from a Catholic standpoint, or from although J.N.D. Kelly is not Catholic, by the way, but from a Catholic standpoint, this is kind of how things occurred. When the summary of Luther's ideas reached Rome early in 1518, Leo instructed the general of his order to silence him. When he then tried to win over Luther's protector, the Elector Frederick of Saxony, the theologian John Eck, and Luther at Leipzig in 1519, Leo published the bull Exsurge Domini in June 1520, condemning Luther on 41 counts. Then on the 3rd of January of 1521, Luther, having publicly burned the bull, he excommunicated him in the bull, and he provides the Latin term for the bull. In other words, the Pope then excommunicates, and Luther is anathema. And so are his followers, by the way. That makes Frederick of Saxony, it makes Philip of Hesse, it makes several others, and I'll name them. Philip of Hesse, John of Saxony, Frederick of Saxony, George of Brandenburg, Duke, Ernest of Lüneburg, Duke Francis of Lüneburg, Prince Wolfgang of Anhalt. Those were the signers, by the way, of the Augsburg Confession in 1530. And those were some of the major supporters of Martin Luther. They were the kings. They were the ones whose nobility under them supported the Reformation of Martin Luther. Now, I want you to know this, that the signing of the Augsburg Confession, and we'll back up and talk about the Augsburg Confession and some of the other things at greater detail, that put these men's life in jeopardy. They made as an enemy Charles V, the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was a strong supporter of the Pope in Rome, Leo X, and later Urban. Or excuse me, not Urban, Clement. Clement VII. When you get an opportunity to take the trek or to visit Germany, you have another sense, not just of the incredible churches, but the great risk that these nobles took in supporting Martin Luther. That it was not an easy thing for a noble, especially not an emperor, to take on the Pope. And essentially these men were taking on the Pope. That in supporting and in protecting Martin Luther, their lives also were in jeopardy. And not just by excommunication. We're not saying that was a real big event. Because former popes had, by bull, excommunicated many who were also reinstated later. And no risk. So it wasn't so much that became a terrible tool. Now, it was a terrible tool for the population, because they felt that if there wasn't a proper Christian burial or a priest to hear confession, that they were not entitled to heaven. But what became worse for the nobles was the understanding of purgatory and what they would have to suffer. Oh yes, when they die, even when they died, they would be forgiven by a priest because of their rank in life. But the sins, they had to sit in purgatory and take pain to purge them of those sins. Remember, this was a critical element in church control. The purging of sin and error by pain. And there were two ways to accomplish that. One is to go to purgatory after one dies and go through an immense amount of pain, and then upon the resurrection be ushered into heaven. The other was to endure it here through Inquisition. So there were two ways, and the church fully understood or fully thought that the burning of John Huss on the stake would purge the sin from him and he would be saved. So that his pain in burning would usher him to heaven and in a sinless state. There were many responses to Luther's path that he took. And I want to cover those a little bit. One of the major responses at this time was by Henry VIII of England. And Henry VIII congratulated the Archbishop of Mainz on the overthrow of the rebel against Christ, he called him. He also writes a book that is an apologetic and defense of Leo, concerning Luther's accusation in the 95 Thesis. And as a result of that publication that Henry VIII wrote, Leo confers upon Henry VIII the defender of the faith. And remember, that will come up many times. And I want to, this is just kind of a dog bone to throw out at this time. Henry VIII becomes a very important character in the Reformation. Because after the Augsburg peace accord, signed with Charles V, essentially, the German Reformation is over. It will not increase. It will not decrease. That the principalities that already are Lutheran will remain Lutheran, and there will be no new principalities added to Lutheranism. So those remaining Catholic will remain Catholic, and as it is to this day. So the Catholics had stopped, at least, the Reformation in Germany. The Reformation was stalled at the Augsburg Peace Accords of 1547, I believe. And so it was completely halted, and the continent was already dealt with. So the Reformation becomes very pertinent in England. And we remember the Reformation, how it started in England. It was over a divorce by Henry of Catherine of Aragon. And he wanted to put Catherine away because he felt that she would not give him a male child as heir. And so therefore a divorce was necessary, or an annulment. And Clement IV is, Clement VII, I'm sorry, is Catherine's brother-in-law. All right, yes, well, actually not brother-in-law. What would he be? He would be like an uncle to Catherine of Aragon, because he was a Habsburg. Now, so he could not take that position. He could not take that position. And Henry knew it, so he started a Reformation. And a man named Cranmer became the head of the Reformation in England. But I want to emphasize that Henry, the defender of the Catholic faith, is the Pope in England. And he does not change. All he does is set up Catholicism only under Henry's rule. And really that is one of the, because of the beginnings of the Reformation in England, it really does not, it never goes through a full Reformation. It does not go through a theological Reformation. It goes through social Reformation, but not theological. There's some elements of it only because of Cranmer, but remember, Cranmer is killed when Catherine takes the throne. And so the Reformation really is pretty much gone in England, excepting on the part of John Knox. Now, that just kind of gives you a little tidbit to consider as we're looking at the elements of the Reformation as Luther had started in motion. The other thing that I want to emphasize before we continue, and that is this, that the Luther Reformation and Luther's sole intent on Reformation was a theological one. That its beginning was theological, and he felt that its end would be also theological. That was one of the reasons why he was so upset with the peasants' revolt. In fact, he at one time he said to Philip of Hesse, hey, do with what you want with the peasants, because they're out of line. And that he had to recant after Philip of Hesse does some real damage, saying this to Philip, you know, you've just ruined your economy. Because where are your resources from except for the peasants? Now you have only 1/3 of the population that you had. In other words, 2/3 of the peasants were killed in Saxony during the Peasants' Revolt. That was one of the reasons why Martin Luther felt that the Reformation that was to take place must be on a theological level and not a social level. Because he, in a sense, he agreed with Erasmus. And later, as Erasmus hurled abuse both ways, one of Erasmus's criticisms of Martin Luther was, "You started the peasant revolt. You started a social uprising that cannot be stopped. And there will be a bloodbath. And that is not where we wanted to go." And Luther would agree to that. Luther would agree to that, but he could not stop it. And he understood this, that theological reformation is going to bring about social reformation. Theological revolution will also bring about social revolution. And there would be no stopping that. But it also distressed Luther, because he felt this, that the peasants, even though this theological reformation had taken place and the glory of God had been reproclaimed, and the God of mercy and grace and love and kindness had been proclaimed, and yet did not have an impact on the behavior of the people. On neither side, on the peasant side, nor on the side of the nobles. The nobility had not changed, nor the peasants had changed. The peasants were still animals, and the nobility were still maniacs and greedy. Let's stop there.